They humiliated him because he was black. Not quietly, not in secret. They called him out in front of a full room, questioned his presence like he was trespassing, not visiting. From the moment he stepped inside that luxury banking hall, every eye marked him as out of place. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't lost. But none of that mattered. They didn't ask why he was there. They assumed he shouldn't be. They gave him forms meant for the homeless. They flagged his identity in their system without cause. They redirected him to the lowest tier seating and made him wait while others strolled past with smiles and champagne. And when he tried to speak, they turned it into a security concern. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was designed. It was rehearsed. It was the kind of discrimination that wears a suit and calls itself procedure. What no one in that building realized was that this man wasn't just any visitor. And the moment they tried to reduce him to a stereotype, they triggered something they couldn't see coming. This story isn't about what they did. It's about what he did next. If you're watching this, hit subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from, and which moment made you stop and think. Because this story doesn't end with silence. It ends with everything flipped. The revolving doors hissed softly as they opened into the pristine marble lobby of Andrus Financial's flagship Manhattan branch. The temperature dropped instantly, from the gritty June heat outside to the crisp luxury of central air that hummed above a space designed for silence and power. Elijah Langston, dressed in a clean but simple navy shirt and charcoal slacks, stepped forward with measured calm. His gait was steady, posture upright, chin level. He carried a leather document pouch under one arm. His wristwatch, old, with a scratched crystal, ticked softly against his skin. He had done this 100 times. But not here. This place was different, and it was about to remind him of that. He walked to the entry gate where biometric sensors verified elite clients. The sensor light flickered, then blinked red. Nothing opened. Elijah paused, stepped back, adjusted his posture, and tried again. The machine's small camera lit up, scanned his face, and again rejected him without a sound. A security guard posted nearby approached. The man was broad-shouldered in a tight black polo, sleeves stretched over gym-toned arms. He spoke before Elijah could. "Sir, you need to queue on the right. That's for first-time clients and general service." Elijah looked at the sideline. No air conditioning. A plastic tape cordoned off a zigzag of worn-out carpet and cracked leather chairs. A woman there dabbed sweat from her child's forehead with a napkin. Elijah glanced back at the glass gate. "I already registered online," he said calmly. "I have a meeting scheduled." The guard didn't check a list. He didn't ask for ID. "Everyone books online now," he said. "But the system decides. If it doesn't open for you, that means your credentials didn't clear premium entry." Elijah's fingers tightened slightly around his pouch. Inside were the forms he'd filled, the bank's own invitation letter, the analysis presentation. But he didn't protest. He just nodded once and stepped to the other line. As he passed, he caught the eyes of a suited man exiting the VIP path. The man looked through him. In the general queue, he waited. 10 minutes passed. The line barely moved. When it did, it wasn't in his favor. He saw others, less formally dressed than him, some speaking loudly on phones, others in athletic wear, glide past into the main gate with a simple blink of green light. Meanwhile, he stood beneath a flickering overhead bulb, the heat growing, the air thick with recycled breath and dust. Inside the main banking floor, behind a smoked glass partition, another employee sat at her desk. Her name tag read Cassandra. Her screen flashed with a notice. External ID requested for account prep, Langston, Elijah. She didn't recognize the name and didn't look too closely. Instead, she toggled a hidden subroutine, legacy fraud scan. It was a tool used sparingly, typically only for clients who triggered alerts, high cash withdrawals, flagged accounts, foreign transaction surges. Elijah had none of these, but he had been categorized manually in the pre-screening notes, unverified source of funds, flagged for review if attempting high-tier access. When his profile loaded, the system hesitated, then tagged his record with a caution flag. Not a block, just a subtle red mark in the corner of his profile window, labeled Review. Tier 1 Override suggested. For Cassandra, it was enough. She tapped the chat icon and typed. Langston showing at intake. History, unclear. Possibly a misrouting. Her supervisor didn't reply immediately. Meanwhile, Elijah stood 20 feet away, unaware that his name had just been flagged in an internal system designed to delay rather than deny. Finally, a receptionist called his name from the far end of the hall. She didn't look up as she said it. Elijah approached, handed over his documents. She flipped them open, barely skimming the letterhead. "You're not on the express client list," she said, tapping her keyboard. "I'll try to get someone from general accounts to see you. Could take a while." Elijah kept his tone level. "I was invited to open a strategic enterprise account." She smiled, but it was the thin kind that ended before it reached her eyes. "We invite a lot of people, sir. It doesn't guarantee anything." 30 minutes in. Still no banker assigned. Still no seat offered. The only beverage station was taped off, under maintenance. No water. He watched an older white couple escorted past him by 2 staffers, their hands full of coffee, a clipboard ready for them to sign. He could hear them laughing. They were shown directly into a glass-walled conference room marked Private Client Division. Elijah's gaze lingered on the polished logo. He closed his eyes for a moment. He approached as instructed, seating himself opposite a young teller with tightly pinned blonde hair and a faint trace of peppermint on her breath. She did not meet his eyes. She slid a folder across the polished table without a greeting. Inside were printed forms, poorly photocopied, edges misaligned. The top page marked with bold text reading Basic Financial Reentry Account Application. Elijah scanned it briefly, his brow tightening as he read the opening line. This application is intended for individuals with no fixed income or transitional housing status. He closed the folder and placed it gently back on the table. "I believe this is a mistake," he said clearly. The teller didn't flinch. She turned to her screen and tapped aimlessly, then without apology reached into a drawer and slid over a second form, this time labeled Fresh Start Checking. Elijah's jaw clenched. It was a bare-bones account type with no overdraft protection, monthly transaction caps, and severe ATM limitations. He hadn't requested anything remotely close to this. His invitation email, now printed and folded in his pouch, outlined a pre-approved strategic enterprise executive profile, complete with multi-currency integration and a private banking consultant. Yet here he was, being handed forms intended for the financially displaced. The teller finally spoke. Her voice was dry and mechanical. "Just fill in the name and signature. We'll take care of the rest later." He leaned forward. "I'd prefer to speak with someone in business development or strategic accounts. This doesn't reflect my request." The teller blinked slowly. "Everyone starts here," she replied. "No exceptions. You want to upgrade later, you can request a review in 30 days. Elijah paused. He knew better than to escalate here. His goal wasn't vengeance. Not yet. His goal was observation, confirmation, evidence. Still, he replied firmly, "Then I'll wait for your manager." 3 desks away, a tall man in a navy suit paused mid-step. Dorian Mayfield, the branch's customer engagement director, had been monitoring Elijah since he entered the building. He had watched the biometric gate fail, noticed the hesitation from Cassandra in the back office, and now he watched this. The man with the composed stare refusing to be quietly dismissed. Dorian was the kind of man who believed order came from subtle signals, not direct confrontation. He saw Elijah's restraint not as strength, but as an opportunity to reassert hierarchy. He stepped forward. "I hear there's some confusion," he said with a rehearsed smile, extending a hand Elijah did not take. "Let me help clarify." Without asking what Elijah came for, Dorian reached behind the teller's desk and retrieved a printed brochure. He unfolded it with 2 fingers and laid it on the desk. Elijah looked down. The title read Financial Empowerment Resources for Justice-Involved Clients. Elijah's chest expanded once, then released. The paper outlined services like post-incarceration loan recovery and vocational readiness savings plans. He looked up, not with anger, but with precision. "I believe there's been another error," he said, now entirely calm. Dorian chuckled. Not nervously, not kindly. The way a man chuckles at a child asking for a yacht on Christmas. He tapped the paper twice. "It's okay. You'd be surprised how many start over here. We don't judge. Everyone deserves a second shot." Elijah held his eyes. "I've never needed a second shot," he said. "And I've never served a sentence." Dorian raised his hands in mock surrender. "We don't look at records. Just here to offer tools." The irony was stark. They claimed not to judge, yet everything they'd done so far was judgment manifest, assumptions dressed as policy. From a side door, a junior associate passed by and caught the interaction. She slowed slightly, recognizing Elijah's name from a calendar update she saw earlier that week. A high-profile onboarding. She remembered the subject line. Yet here he was, standing under the full weight of institutional dismissal. The associate hesitated, opened her mouth, then kept walking. She wasn't senior enough to interfere. Elijah, meanwhile, refused the brochure without touching it. Dorian shrugged. "Let us know when you're ready to proceed. We have limited space today. Can't hold the desk long." Elijah stood. He thanked no one. As he turned, he noticed something odd. A woman at the VIP business station received a leather-bound folder marked Institutional Client Welcome Kit. The same package mentioned in his original appointment confirmation. But it wasn't for him. It was being presented to a man who had entered 10 minutes after Elijah, with no visible documents, no appointment, and a backpack slung low over one shoulder. That man laughed loudly, took the folder, and called someone on speakerphone, describing the champagne they served last time. Elijah walked toward the window at the far end of the floor. He needed a moment, a pause. The digital clock on the wall showed 11:23. He had been in this bank for nearly 90 minutes. No water, no assistance. And now, an application form made for displaced persons and a pamphlet suggesting he was recently released from prison. Behind him, the junior associate opened her email quietly, searching Elijah's name. Instead, he crossed to the adjacent lounge space labeled Discretionary Client Consultation, a soft corner of cream leather seats, polished black with side tables, and recessed lighting designed to make even impatience feel luxurious. A pot of orchids sat centered on a marble-top coffee table. He didn't touch it. He sat at the edge of the outermost chair, back straight, hands folded over the document pouch still pressed against his chest. If the bank truly treated dignity as a matter of protocol, then this space, unused and open, was fair ground. He didn't take the espresso water from the table, nor did he plug his charger into the USB port near the armrest. He merely waited, watching, listening, measuring. 15 minutes passed. 2 customer associates passed by. Neither stopped. One looked directly at him, eyes darting to his lapel, then away. A man with a smartwatch and a Bluetooth headset entered the lounge and was immediately greeted by name. A personal banker offered him Pellegrino, laughed at a half-joke, then escorted him through a frosted glass door. The conversation barely faded as it disappeared behind walls. Elijah checked his watch. 11:47. Time was not the issue. Treatment was. Respect was. Pattern was. And the pattern was tightening. The moment arrived when a floor assistant named Chelsea, dressed in black and gold, crossed the floor with a purposeful stride. Her heels struck marble in sharp, echoing taps. She walked directly toward Elijah with the practiced grace of someone trained to smile while delivering unpleasant messages. As she approached, other heads in the lounge turned subtly. People sensed tension before it arrived. She didn't kneel. She didn't whisper. She spoke in a tone clear enough to carry, but laced with just enough forced politeness to pass, as standard procedure. "Sir," she said, "this area is reserved for active platinum consultations. Unless you're accompanied by an executive banker, I'll have to ask you to return to the general lobby." Elijah met her gaze. He didn't rise immediately. He asked if this lounge was truly at capacity, or if a seat in the corner disrupted the visual uniformity of privilege. She repeated her request without answering. "We ask that clients use the designated spaces assigned to their current service tier. That word, tier. As he stood, he noticed the shift in atmosphere. Not in her, not in himself, but in the room. 3 patrons now watched him. A woman with a silk scarf pulled closer to her purse. A man with horn-rimmed glasses adjusted his sleeve like an instinctive tick. Nobody spoke, but the weight of implication was crushing. Elijah walked back toward the general area. Chelsea's eyes followed. She didn't return to her desk. She stood beside the orchids, checking something on her tablet, her expression unreadable. And then the camera blinked. Elijah didn't notice it at first. Mounted above the alcove where he'd sat was a small motion-triggered security dome. Unremarkable. Standard protocol. But inside the surveillance room, a motion flag had been raised. Someone in operations had manually initiated an observation sequence, not because of a behavior, but because of a face. Elijah's profile had been tagged as requiring background verification, a silent flag added after Cassandra's fraud scan. That flag had triggered a visual lock. A clerk reviewing a dozen feeds noticed the alert. He tapped a screen, zoomed the frame. A 4K crop of Elijah's face froze, then passed to the advertising management dashboard. From there, the mistake happened, or perhaps, depending on one's interpretation, it was no mistake at all. Within minutes, the main display screen in the open banking floor, meant to play muted videos about mobile apps and wealth planning, briefly shifted content. A system-wide loop refresh ran without warning, pushing a still frame overlay meant for internal testing. On that screen, in front of over 50 clients and 10 staff, appeared Elijah's cropped profile. Beneath it, a red banner. Review pending. High-risk individual, subject to secondary verification. No one knew who authorized the display. No one took it down for 32 seconds. And 32 seconds was an eternity when silence falls. Elijah had just reached the vending area when he noticed it. He stopped mid-stride, looked up, and saw his own image framed in a false context. The damage was immediate. Whispers. A gasp. One client subtly pointed. Another leaned toward their child. Elijah stood completely still. He didn't drop his documents. He didn't lower his eyes. He simply stared at the screen as it looped back to a mobile banking ad with cartoon characters. No announcement followed. No apology. The screen returned to normal as though nothing had happened. But everything had changed. He turned to face the desk again. This time, people moved aside without being asked. One of the receptionists whispered frantically into a phone. Another adjusted her earpiece and vanished behind a frosted door. Dorian emerged 5 minutes later, breath shallow, smile gone. He didn't speak. His eyes swept the room like a man searching for the source of a fire he already smelled but couldn't find. Elijah said nothing. At the top of the page, he had already drawn a timestamp. 12:09 p.m. Above him, the scrolling news ticker wrapped around the curved LED display, announcing market fluctuations, crypto forecasts, and corporate acquisitions. He ignored it. He was tracking a different kind of data: behavior, language, omissions, tone. Across the room, 2 customer associates glanced his way, then leaned closer together and spoke in hushed tones. He had become an anomaly in their world, a figure who didn't shout, didn't leave, didn't crumble. Instead, he stayed. That unsettled them more than outrage ever could. After precisely 11 minutes, Elijah closed the notebook, slid it into his pouch, and walked back to the main floor. He did not return to the general desk. Instead, he walked directly to the access kiosk beside the glass offices. A touchscreen lit up, welcoming him. He tapped through the interface to request access to his business pre-setup panel, a tool meant for executive clients setting up institutional relationships. The system hesitated. Then the screen flickered. A red notice blinked into view. Unable to proceed. Verification suspended. Please contact support. He tried again. Same result. He turned and approached the desk of the nearest digital liaison. The woman at the station glanced at her screen, checked his client ID, and frowned. She said, with a hint of apology, "Sir, your profile is currently pending identity enhancement. Our system flagged an inconsistency in your visual verification." Elijah raised an eyebrow. My documentation is in order. I've submitted my business license, banking reference letters, and investor identification. She nodded, almost nervously. Yes, but the profile picture on file was flagged by our AI protocol as lacking professional presentation. The algorithm detects visual tone for security. It automatically halted the approval chain. Elijah's voice was calm but precise. You're saying a facial photo, taken from a government-issued ID, was declined because it doesn't look corporate enough. The liaison didn't reply. Instead, she handed him a flyer with a QR code labeled Photo Compliance Policy. He took it, turned it over, and saw in fine print a clause. Clients may be temporarily restricted from initiating account access if biometric visual markers fall below confidence threshold. He recognized the language instantly. Vague, circular, designed not to protect clients, but to protect liability. Elijah asked to speak with digital onboarding directly. The liaison hesitated, then tapped into her call system. She whispered something too softly for him to hear. A few moments later, she looked up and said, "Someone will be with you shortly." Dorian appeared 3 minutes later. His jacket was now off, his shirt sleeves rolled once at the forearm, tie slightly loosened. He looked like a man trying to project calm while controlling chaos. "We're working through a system congestion issue," he said. "Looks like your credentials were routed through legacy review. Happens sometimes when tags are misaligned." Elijah didn't respond. Dorian leaned closer, lowered his voice. "I'd recommend re-uploading a corporate headshot. One with clean lighting. Maybe in a suit jacket. Makes the algorithm feel more confident." Elijah stared at him. "The algorithm?" Dorian smiled without humor. "It's out of our hands, you understand." At the same time, in the bank's internal communication server, Dorian had already sent a priority request to Cassandra. The message was simple. Hold Elijah Langston on manual lock. Suspend domain-linked verifications until further notice. Code, non-standard intake. Cassandra didn't question it. She clicked a box on her screen labeled Suspend Associated Credentials. Within seconds, Elijah's email, linked to the bank's onboarding portal, was locked out. Not permanently, just long enough to stall him. Just enough to send a signal. Elijah didn't know it yet, but when he would later try to retrieve the onboarding materials he uploaded 3 days prior, he would receive a new message. Access denied. File expired or administrator revoked permission. Back at the lobby, Elijah requested an override to access his uploaded documents through a private banking liaison. Another liaison, a young man named Reggie, reviewed his file and frowned. "I'm sorry," Reggie said. "Your documents were routed to our internal audit queue. It's a random integrity sweep. You should receive an update in 48 hours. Elijah leaned slightly closer. "And who authorized that queue placement?" Reggie didn't answer. He tapped his screen, then quickly shifted windows. "I'm not sure. It doesn't say." Elijah knew better. The logs were there, but access was locked by user clearance. And Reggie wasn't cleared. But someone was. Someone had just tried to cut off his ability to control his own financial narrative. This was no longer about mistaken identity or casual indifference. This was systematic, slowly tightening restrictions under the guise of compliance. First, visual nonconformity. Then, internal flags. Now, digital erasure. Elijah turned away from the desk and walked toward the outer balcony facing the courtyard. Behind the tinted glass, he watched as another client shook hands with a vice president. They laughed. A folder exchanged hands. No ID checks. No photo protocol. Just access. Just trust. Elijah stood there for a full minute, unmoving. Then he returned to the public use terminal in the far corner of the lobby. It was slower, clunkier, and less intuitive than the onboarding panels, but it still allowed him to log into the bank's general investor portal. He typed slowly, carefully. His access code bypassed 3 levels before stalling. Then, suddenly, the system rebooted. A screen appeared. Session terminated. Administrative lock in progress. Please contact technical control. Elijah sat still. This wasn't random. It was escalation. He looked up at the ceiling. Somewhere, someone behind the system wanted to bury a problem by freezing the one person who might have held the answers. Elijah's name no longer floated beneath smiles. It surfaced behind clipped tones, sideways glances, and sudden pauses in conversation when he approached. He had not spoken with Dorian again. The silence between them had calcified into a structure more powerful than words, a boundary. Elijah knew the signs. He had seen institutions build walls of bureaucracy before, but rarely had the mortar been laid this fast. He moved through the floor with purpose. Even though his digital credentials were locked, he still held one card, presence. And his presence was becoming more powerful than any password. That fact did not sit well with those managing the optics of the space. An assistant manager whispered to a floor liaison, then quickly typed a note into her handheld device. Moments later, a voice came over the public intercom, an action rare inside this type of facility, where client privacy was paramount. Mr. Elijah Langston, the voice called, echoing through the marble atrium. Your consultation for the Community Reintegration Lending Program is ready. Please proceed to Station 12. Elijah froze mid-step. Around him, heads turned. A child paused mid-sip from a juice box. A well-dressed man at a glass counter tilted his head, eyebrows raised. A woman in pearls muttered something to her partner. Elijah's fingers tightened against his document pouch. He had not enrolled in any reintegration program. The implication was subtle but strategic. The program referenced was designed for individuals returning to financial independence following incarceration. The announcement, whether error or sabotage, placed Elijah in a category he did not belong to, and did so in front of an audience designed to judge. He did not approach Station 12. Instead, he turned toward the front desk where the floor administrator stood with practiced innocence. "There's been a mistake," he said evenly. "I did not sign up for that program." The administrator's smile was too quick. "It must be a cross-reference error. Sometimes new applicants get misrouted." Elijah's response was colder. "You're telling me a name-specific voice call that exposed a confidential program was just a routing error?" The administrator looked away. "I'll report the incident." "It's been noted." Elijah didn't move. Noted by whom? She didn't answer. He returned to the bench near the elevators. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then came the final insult to personal dignity, unspoken, uninvited, and wrapped in the soft fabric of cultural ignorance. Elijah's phone rang. He answered. On the other end was his mother, calling from another state. Her voice carried warmth, familiarity, and concern. He spoke to her in Yoruba, their shared native language. He kept his voice low, posture composed. They talked briefly. He assured her everything was fine. Then came the shadow. A security guard approached, not the first one he'd encountered, but another, bulkier, with a different name tag. The guard didn't greet him. He stood just a little too close and said, "Sir, you'll need to end the call or switch to English. We've had a guest express discomfort with unfamiliar languages near the restricted zone." Elijah stared at him. "Are you saying someone complained about my mother tongue?" The guard didn't blink. "We're just maintaining a calm environment. Unexpected speech patterns can create anxiety for some patrons." Elijah stood slowly, phone still in hand, and said into the receiver, "I'll call you back, Mom," then ended the call. He looked the guard in the eye and asked, "Are you formally warning me?" The guard hesitated, then stepped back without answering. Elijah sat again. That exchange, small, quiet, deniable, was designed to do exactly what it had done. Reinforce the idea that he didn't belong, even in the language he used to speak to his own blood. And yet, Elijah said nothing. He simply opened his notebook and wrote, "Intercom misuse, personal identification breach, linguistic profiling, time, 1:03 p.m. Across the floor, a young intern in a gray blazer witnessed the entire scene. She did not speak, but her face shifted from passive curiosity to quiet horror. She opened a browser window on her tablet and searched for Elijah's name, just to be sure. What she found, his firm's profile, speaking engagements, credentials, holdings, did not align with what she had just watched unfold. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. Then, silently, she began to draft an internal memo labeled Confidential Observation, Potential Discrimination Event. Back on the bench, Elijah returned to the kiosk and attempted once again to request print access for his onboarding file, hoping the document pathway might have reset. It had not. The screen displayed a new message now: request denied. Administrative override applied by user D. Mayfield. Elijah smiled faintly. He whispered to himself, so now it's official. He stood and walked toward the front again, not to speak, but simply to be visible. The act itself was resistance. Being seen unmoved, unwrecked, was more disruptive now than confrontation. One woman moved her purse to the other side as he passed. Another checked her phone reflexively. Elijah walked on. In his head, he recounted every moment from the last 4 hours. The rejections, the misdirections, the public announcements, the linguistic policing, all of it carefully measured, all of it impossible to prove as intent, yet unmistakable when stacked together. And all of it had now reached a new height: character assassination by suggestion. Elijah remained seated at the edge of the marble bench near the customer kiosk, his posture still precise, his breathing steady. The last encounter with the security guard had drawn more attention than intended, and now the atmosphere buzzed with a manufactured urgency, one designed to make him the problem. Employees whispered as they walked by, and more than one staffer avoided eye contact entirely. Then it came, the next move in this quiet siege. A supervisor named Gerald approached with a clipboard. His tone was neutral, rehearsed, just firm enough to sound official, without tipping into confrontation. He began with a phrase Elijah had heard too many times in rooms like this. "Just a quick formality, sir," Gerald said, extending the clipboard. Standard protocol when interactions draw attention from security. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he read the first line. A behavioral agreement form. Its heading was marked Non-Disruption Compliance Statement. The clauses were thinly veiled threats, a promise not to speak loudly, to follow all verbal directions from staff, and not to use recording devices or external communication tools in branch premises without written consent. At the bottom, a checkbox. Confirm understanding of possible 6-month probationary observation period. Elijah looked up. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't disrupted any procedure." Gerald replied, "It's not a disciplinary measure, just a precaution." Elijah's voice remained calm. "A precaution against what, exactly?" Gerald did not answer. He gestured toward the clipboard and added, "We'll need acknowledgement before we can proceed with any additional service requests." Elijah held the pen for a full 10 seconds. Signing it wasn't consent, it was survival. The kind of survival Black professionals understood instinctively. He signed. The form disappeared into Gerald's hands like a secret folded shut. Elijah received no copy, no confirmation receipt, only a brief nod, and then Gerald walked away, leaving him alone once more in the corner of a building designed to make people like him disappear without ever being told to leave. 20 minutes later, Dorian returned. His face was stretched thin with false sympathy, the corners of his lips moving only enough to feign concern. In his hand was a folder with a red tab marked Urgent, Client PRE Screening. He extended it toward Elijah. "This will help us expedite your review," he said. Elijah accepted the folder cautiously, noting its weight. It was too light for any real documentation. When he opened it, the irony landed like a blow. Inside were 6 printed pages. Each page was part of a financial literacy workbook, designed not for institutional clients or professional consultants, but for early secondary education. The titles read like insults: Understanding a Savings Account, Why Budgeting Matters, How to Use a Debit Card Safely. On the last page, a fill-in-the-blank worksheet asked, if you had $100 and spent $45 on sneakers, how much would you have left for groceries? Elijah closed the folder without expression. Dorian misread his silence. "We find it useful to start with the basics," he offered, still playing the role of supportive educator. "Once we're confident there's alignment in understanding, we can talk premium tools." Elijah's voice was low, unhurried. "So now your vetting protocol includes math games?" Dorian's smile flickered. It's part of our financial empowerment track. We've seen it really help applicants who aren't used to structured financial systems. Elijah stared at him. You mean applicants you don't expect to understand structure? Dorian didn't reply. He simply gestured toward the hallway behind the premium glass doors. Whenever you're ready, someone can help walk you through it. Elijah did not move. He held the folder for another moment, then placed it carefully back on the table. I've already built systems bigger than this building, he said, not as a boast, but as a ledger entry spoken aloud. And I've advised regulators who'd shutter this branch over a single paragraph from that form you made me sign. Dorian's smile cracked fully now. Sir, he said, if you're not comfortable continuing the process, you're welcome to withdraw your application. Elijah stood, not abruptly, not in anger, simply with intent. He did not speak again. He walked back toward the central seating area, retrieved his document pouch, and opened his secure device. On the encrypted screen, he navigated to a buried folder marked Internal Calibration Protocols. There, he selected a file labeled 3-strike screening matrix. Strike 1 had been the denied biometric access. Strike 2, the public mislabeling and digital shutdown. Strike 3, now confirmed, was this: procedural re-education disguised as financial onboarding. He initiated a flag, an internal alert to the Oversight Committee of the Parent Investment Fund. Within 2 minutes, a silent system ping was sent through the company's compliance algorithm. The title: Behavioral Review Trigger Priority Class. The system didn't ask for further input. It didn't need it. It only responded one way, by escalating upward. Back in the branch, Dorian returned to the service desk. He made a call from the internal line, speaking low and fast. He didn't take the packet. No reaction. Just calm. It's like he's watching the whole place. On the other end, Cassandra replied, Should we lock his hardware MAC address? Dorian hesitated. Let's hold. I don't want IT jumping in yet. But it was already too late. The silent ping had passed through firewall tiers, reaching systems neither of them controlled. And the oversight team didn't wait for permission to investigate. The building's interior lighting had adjusted automatically, brightening to maintain the same illusion of sterile efficiency it had held all morning. But the illusion was cracking. Every person who passed him seemed more cautious, more aware of his presence, as if he had transformed into something no longer dismissible, no longer controllable. He appeared quiet, passive, still. But inside the storm had already started. He unzipped the pouch with unhurried hands and removed his second device, a matte black ultra-thin laptop marked only by a private emblem on the lower right corner. It wasn't a personal device. It was organizational, hardened, built to avoid detection across civilian networks. With one keystroke, Elijah activated the layered login. The screen prompted for 3 biometric steps, each of which he passed with ease. The moment he accessed the system, a quiet cascade of encryption keys launched in the background, alerting his firm's back-end security layer that the executive platform had been engaged from a live, high-risk environment. The software didn't ask questions. It simply adjusted. Once inside the dashboard, Elijah navigated through 5 partitions of project data, past standard audits and quarterly summaries, until he reached a tab marked Discretionary Oversight, Regional Asset Risk Reviews. Inside that folder lived the truth, a compilation of surveillance footage, flagged incident logs, real-time compliance heat maps, and performance risk indicators sourced from 8 flagship locations across the country. The Manhattan branch of Andrus Financial, the very building he now sat inside, was at the top of the risk list. He selected the most recent entry. The video loaded instantly. It was from just 3 days prior, pulled from the branch's own internal training session. The opening frame showed Dorian standing before a group of employees in the staff break room, pointing at a screen. Elijah's own face was displayed in the corner, his headshot from the initial onboarding file. A subtitle appeared across the bottom: Strategic Asset Tier Unconfirmed. Elijah didn't blink as he watched Dorian speak. Clients with questionable backgrounds don't always look it, the video captured him saying. Some slip through intake. When you see red flags, don't wait for approval. Intercept. Defer. Delay. Murmurs of agreement followed. The video paused automatically as the system prompted. Include in review packet? Elijah clicked yes. He tabbed into the notes folder next, pulling up a document he himself had authored 2 weeks ago. Internal Recommendation Conditional Continuation of Manhattan Branch, authored by Langston E. It was marked private. In it, he had outlined 3 warning metrics: customer engagement misconduct, misuse of behavioral documentation, and incident escalation against pre-screened oversight agents. As of 10:37 that morning, all 3 thresholds had been breached. The system recognized this automatically, highlighting his notes in yellow and adding a pulsing timestamp to the corner. Escalation review pending. Elijah initiated a review seal, a command only available to executive-level strategists within the investment group. It triggered a lockdown on local data entries related to his profile, preserved video evidence, and notified the board's ethics council that a priority branch was now under internal audit. Once the seal engaged, no employee at the branch would be able to modify any logs, delete messages, or adjust digital surveillance footage for 72 hours. And they wouldn't even know it had happened until the compliance team arrived in person. Next, he tapped into the secure communication relay, recording a short internal message. Langston Elijah. Oversight protocol confirmed breach. All 3 categories satisfied. Manhattan branch, non-compliant. Proceeding with Phase 2 asset integrity escalation. Formal notice to follow. He tagged the message and pressed send. The signal crossed the system's private network, reaching inboxes that no one in the building had ever seen. Back on the public-facing floor, Dorian paced behind the security glass, checking his tablet again. Something had changed. The system had locked him out of Elijah's file. An error message had appeared. Authorization referred to strategic desk. That desk didn't exist inside the branch. It only existed 2 tiers above his clearance. He called Cassandra. "I can't access the Langston file," he said, his voice clipped. Cassandra responded immediately. "He's on an escalation list. That's a corporate override. You didn't trigger it." Dorian's eyes narrowed. "No," he said. "Then who the hell did?" Elijah, meanwhile, clicked into the communication log of internal behavior flags. Every note, every whisper of data related to his visit was now being pulled into the audit. The voice announcement from earlier, labeling him as a reintegration program applicant, had been recorded and matched to a staff member's user ID. The behavioral contract form he was forced to sign had already been uploaded into the compliance review packet. Even the false visual flag about his ID photo had been traced back to Cassandra's manual override, linking her directly to a discrimination trigger that violated the very ethics clause the branch signed quarterly to remain funded. He then cross-referenced the metrics with the funding model. Andrus Financial did not operate independently. It was partially funded and controlled through corporate capital infusion from Elijah's own investment consortium. Meaning, if that funding was pulled, not only would the branch collapse, but it would signal to shareholders a failure in due diligence and leadership integrity. Cassandra stood beside him with arms crossed, watching the line of code errors appearing on her tablet. Authorization denied appeared repeatedly in red on both their screens, signaling a loss of administrative access neither had experienced before. This wasn't a glitch. It was a protocol shift. And that kind of shift only came from above. What they didn't know yet was that above had arrived and was sitting 20 feet away with complete control over the floor they believed they ruled. Elijah rose from the bench slowly and walked toward the center reception counter, where 2 employees continued processing appointments with stiff, overtrained smiles. He didn't speak at first. He simply reached into his pouch, removed a polished titanium USB drive with the firm's insignia engraved at the base, and held it calmly before one of the receptionists. The woman hesitated, unsure whether she had the authority to allow a client to use a system port. Elijah answered the hesitation with a line that immediately bypassed her doubt. "Please switch your terminal to executive access mode and initiate compliance override shell protocol." She blinked. I don't have that clearance." Elijah nodded, then added, "That terminal does." She looked down at her keyboard. The port had already unlocked. He connected the drive. The system paused for less than 3 seconds before adjusting. The screen shifted tone, first dimming, then cycling through 2 corporate banners before landing on a black interface with gold lettering. At the top, the header read, Level 3 Audit Command Active. Beneath it, a rotating security wheel appeared with the words, Restricted Compliance Mode Engaged. In the lower corner, Elijah's name populated automatically, followed by his formal title, Regional Strategy Director, North American Holdings, Prometheus Capital. The receptionist stepped back, stunned. Elijah didn't flinch. His hands moved calmly across the terminal, selecting options with the confidence of someone who had designed the protocols himself. He wasn't just reporting violations anymore. He was executing the consequences. From inside the compliance panel, Elijah initiated protocol, Aegis Lock, an emergency audit mode designed to isolate a branch from further internal data manipulation while preserving all surveillance, staff movement, and internal communication logs. Once triggered, the system sent out 2 pings, one to the compliance chain and one to the regional executive assigned to the facility. The response window was fixed, 60 minutes. If the executive failed to appear in person within the hour, the system defaulted to structural review, and the branch would be flagged for conditional suspension pending board investigation. On the screen, a new tab opened. It read, Notification sent, executive response required. Beneath it, a real-time timer began counting down from 60:00. Elijah stepped back from the terminal, folded his hands in front of him, and waited. The reaction wasn't immediate, but it was loud. Somewhere behind the walls, a loud tone echoed, a high-pitched alarm heard only by administrators. Cassandra's tablet froze. Her apps dimmed. Her system attempted to reboot, but instead displayed a system-level message. Operations contained executive oversight in progress. Dorian stormed out of his office, demanding answers. Why is the floor on lock mode? He snapped. An associate whispered, one of the clients triggered compliance shell access. Dorian's face drained to color. That's impossible. No one here has that clearance. Another voice, shaky and uncertain, said from across the desk, he does. Then came the broadcast. All wall-mounted monitors across the branch, normally used to display promotional videos and market updates, flickered simultaneously. A black screen filled each one, followed by a login prompt. Elijah's credentials flashed briefly, verifying the origin of the command. Then his face appeared live across all terminals, eyes calm, suit collar sharp, voice steady and unshaken. This branch is now under strategic compliance lockdown, per Directive CP7, Article 8. I am Elijah Langston, Oversight Director for Regional Asset Integrity under Prometheus Capital Holdings. This location has violated critical ethical protocol thresholds, and a full review is now in effect. Every staff member stopped moving. One dropped a clipboard. A client near the business desk whispered, "That's him." Dorian stood frozen mid-step, his mouth slightly open. Elijah continued, voice measured but clear. All operations are to halt immediately. No data may be modified, no files may be purged, and no meetings may proceed without direct approval from Prometheus Audit Command. Any attempt to bypass these restrictions will trigger immediate board escalation. The following staff are now placed on provisional administrative hold: Dorian Mayfield, Cassandra Helm, Gerald Rowe, and Reggie Atkins. You are to step away from your workstations and report to Room 2C for compliance detainment until instructed otherwise. This is not a request. A silence followed, so heavy it nearly cracked the windows. The music that usually played in the lobby was replaced by soft mechanical humming from the cooling units above. All eyes were now split between two poles: Elijah, calm and still near Room 2C, and Dorian, cornered and hollow-eyed in front of the branch's main service desk. The regional compliance officer stood near him with a clipboard and a directive. She held authority not in volume, but in posture. Her instructions were clear. Per Clause 11.3 of the Emergency Oversight Charter, all senior operational staff under provisional suspension were required to recite, in full, the institution's code of ethics before personnel and present clientele, as part of a transparency clause adopted during the last shareholder summit. Dorian had never been required to read the code aloud. Like most middle management, he had clicked through it during onboarding and referenced it occasionally during employee evaluations. Now it sat in his hand, printed in bold, with every clause highlighted, each paragraph carrying a weight he had previously ignored. He glanced around. The lobby was still populated with clients, some seated, others lingering near counters, none willing to leave. A few pulled out their phones, subtly filming. Elijah said nothing. He did not need to. The structure was speaking for him now. The officer gestured once. Dorian began reading. His voice wavered at first. At Andrews Financial, we commit to the equitable treatment of all individuals regardless of background, race, origin, or identity. A pause. His throat tightened. We recognize the inherent dignity of every client and promise to uphold a standard of trust that reflects the diversity of the communities we serve. Another pause. The lines weren't long, but they cut deep when spoken under the pressure of contradiction. His face reddened as he reached the final clause. Employees are expected to maintain the highest level of professional integrity and are accountable for creating a safe and inclusive environment. His voice broke slightly. He lowered the page. The room was quiet. The officer said, "Sign and date the document." Dorian obeyed. His signature trembled. Elijah did not watch with cruelty. He simply observed. The act of witnessing had become enough. Meanwhile, on the compliance dashboard displayed to internal auditors and upper management, the violations continued populating. The voice recording of the public intercom announcement, misidentifying Elijah as part of a reintegration program, was logged with a timestamp and user ID. The form he had been forced to sign was attached with metadata, proving it had not been issued to any other client that day. Surveillance footage was cross-referenced with system entries and staff interactions. A full chronology of Elijah's experience was reconstructed in a forensic timeline that removed ambiguity from motive. The conclusion was unanimous. Pattern behavior with indicators of racial profiling, abuse of discretion, and systematic exclusion. But the most damning line wasn't generated by an algorithm. It came from a 2-year-old spreadsheet uploaded during the audit. A column of internal complaints logged by former clients revealed that this branch, Dorian's branch, had the highest concentration of unresolved discrimination claims across the entire Northeast region. 46 individual complaints, buried under bureaucratic processing codes, never escalated. That document had been hidden under a non-standard intake file. Now it was broadcast on the internal compliance network, shared with board-level governance. The headline at the top read, "Unprocessed Discriminatory Incident Reports, Branch 38C Manhattan." And it was signed off by none other than Dorian Mayfield. When this revelation was read aloud by the compliance officer to the executive observers on call via livestream, there was no outrage, only process. The board's head of internal ethics simply stated, "Recommendation: initiate full disciplinary review. Recommend dismissal pending investigation. Consider branch funding suspension." The notation was tagged "Archived" and attached to a quarterly shareholder update currently in preparation. The decision was no longer about fixing a broken workflow. It was now about protecting the institution's reputation. Across the lobby, Cassandra sat quietly, no longer holding her tablet. Her access had been revoked. Her badge had gone dark. The receptionist, who once redirected Elijah to low-tier seating, was now answering questions from another compliance liaison who had begun conducting client interviews. Staff who had laughed earlier in the day now watched the proceedings in stunned silence, unsure whether they would be next to fall beneath the sweeping arc of the audit. As required by Prometheus Capital's strategic compliance model, a notice of preliminary branch ranking was posted in the staff's internal system, visible to everyone still logged in before the lockdown. A yellow box appeared with the following statement: "This location is currently under ethical performance review and ranks at the bottom 5% of all assessed branches in terms of client treatment equity." A notation below added, "Subject to public disclosure pending legal review." Within an hour, the press could know. 12 months passed, not quietly, not gently, but with the slow pressure of accountability grinding against legacy systems once thought immovable. The Manhattan branch of Andrus Financial was restructured entirely. Its upper management was replaced, its policies rewritten from the ground up, and every client-facing protocol reviewed by third-party equity auditors. The report issued by Prometheus Capital's Ethics Division made headlines when released, praised for its candor, its precision, and its unflinching exposure of systemic bias within high-end financial institutions. Yet the report itself was not the final word. The aftermath wasn't just regulatory, it was human. One of the men it reshaped stood now beneath a different kind of spotlight. The hall was modern, wrapped in clean lines and brushed steel, the stage framed by soft amber light, the backdrop bearing a single phrase: redesigning power, ethics, equity, and executive responsibility. The keynote speaker was not Elijah. He sat anonymously in the second row, wearing a charcoal suit, hands clasped loosely in his lap, attention focused. The man on stage, by contrast, had a name that used to provoke silence, but now carried a different weight. Dorian Mayfield, once the face of discretionary abuse at Branch 38C, now introduced as lead program director for equity restoration and bias intervention at the newly formed Andrus Institute of Ethical Finance. He stood taller than he once had, not out of pride, but out of necessity. His notes were minimal. His voice was steady but subdued, lacking the arrogance it once carried. "I am not here today as an expert," he began. "I'm here as a consequence." That line alone silenced a room filled with executives, consultants, and compliance officers from across sectors. Over the next 30 minutes, Dorian laid out the journey, not just the public fall from institutional grace, but the quieter, messier internal process of reckoning with who he had been and why. He admitted to deferring blame, to hiding behind systems, to using policy as a shield. He spoke of watching the surveillance footage not as a defendant, but as a witness to his own willful blindness. He named each failure, the assumption, the silence, the passivity that enabled cruelty wrapped in policy. He spoke of Cassandra's departure and her subsequent decision to leave finance altogether. He described the discomfort of walking back into a space where his name evoked mistrust, and the months spent earning access to conversations he used to lead with false confidence. But most importantly, he described the shift, not from guilt, but from clarity. "I thought being caught was the worst thing that could happen to me," he said, pausing for a long breath, "but being unchanged would have been worse." The audience didn't applaud immediately. They didn't need to. The weight of the message lingered longer than noise. Later that afternoon, a breakout session unfolded in a quieter chamber of the venue. Attendees discussed realignment strategies, the cost of inaction, and the mechanisms required to prevent institutional bias from mutating into protocol. Elijah didn't speak. He moved through the room, unnoticed by most, but not by Dorian. At the reception that evening, Dorian approached him. He didn't shake hands. He didn't initiate small talk. He simply stood before Elijah and said, "I didn't deserve the patience you gave me." Elijah looked at him, eyes steady, no malice, no victory. Dorian continued, "But I do something with it now. Every day, every training, every lecture. I remind them that being right isn't enough if you build on the wrong foundation." Elijah finally responded. "Then rebuild something better," he said. Dorian nodded. "I am." Months later, Dorian would lead a closed-door training for executive onboarding at another major financial institution, where he would use the Branch 38C case study as a central learning model. He would read aloud the compliance violation report, not to shame the participants, but to remind them that systems are reflections of the people who shape them, and that neglect, when institutionalized, becomes culture. Andrus Financial, now under complete review by its parent consortium, would restructure its leadership model to include rotating oversight by Prometheus Capital, a move spearheaded by Elijah and his team. Transparency modules were embedded in client experience systems, and anonymous evaluation tools were rolled out nationwide. No longer could a complaint be silenced by a status flag. No longer could a name be quietly tagged as undeserving without a full review. In time, Elijah would step away from frontline oversight, shifting instead to global policy advisory. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave a TED Talk. His work lived in the margins, inside the rewrites of policy documents, in the algorithms he adjusted to detect pattern bias, and in the unspoken trust rebuilt between clients and institutions that had once failed them. But his presence never left the system. Every audit template carried his signature line of logic. Every ethics clause bore his framework. Every executive trained under Dorian recited words he once embodied in silence. The legacy of what happened at Branch 38C was not scandal. It was restoration. And somewhere between exposure and redemption, between downfall and discipline, between silence and transformation, a new principle was born, not one written in stone, but lived in process. That power does not equal justice. But justice, when structured and defended, becomes unbreakable. The end. If this story moved you or made you think, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives like this. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what moment in the story hit you the hardest. Was it the public humiliation, the silent retaliation, or the final redemption? We're reading every comment. Your perspective matters.